Ladies and gentlemen, imagine a legend, a master of swift, decisive warfare, a phantom in the desert who struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. We're talking, of course, about Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. But today, we're not going to tell the story of his triumphs. Instead, we're going to delve into his last, most desperate battle in North Africa, a campaign that would mark not just the end of an era for him, but a brutal, pivotal turning point for the Allies, forever etched into the annals of World War II. This isn't the Rommel of early war glory, leading audacious flanking maneuvers under the scorching sun. This is the Rommel fighting with his back against the wall, his once invincible Panzers now mere shadows of their former selves, facing a new and unexpected adversary, the untested, yet fiercely determined American soldier. And as he grappled with this fresh challenge, an older, more familiar enemy was relentlessly closing in from behind, tightening a noose that would ultimately define his North African destiny. This is the story of Tunisia, 1943, and the bitter taste of Tunisgrad. By late 1942, the Axis dream in North Africa was crumbling under the relentless weight of Allied pressure. Rommel, once the undisputed master of desert warfare, had suffered a devastating blow at El Alamein in November. That defeat wasn't just a tactical setback, it was a psychological earthquake. It shattered the illusion of Axis invincibility and sent his German-Italian Panzer army on a grueling 2,500-kilometer retreat across the vast, unforgiving Libyan desert. Imagine the exhaustion, the dwindling morale, the sight of the British Eighth Army under the methodical General Bernard Montgomery nipping at their heels every step of the way. Every mile was a testament to their dwindling strength, every lost vehicle a piece of their shattered confidence. But the situation was about to become infinitely more complicated. While Montgomery pushed from the east, a massive Anglo-American force, under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, executed Operation Torch. In November 1942, these Allied troops landed in Morocco and Algeria, opening a second, entirely unexpected front in the West. Suddenly, the Axis forces in North Africa weren't just retreating. They were being caught in a gigantic pincer movement. The strategic objective for both sides became crystal clear: Tunisia. This small, rugged nation was home to the last major Axis ports of Bizerte and Tunis. For Rommel, these ports were the last hope, a chance to shorten his agonizingly long supply lines and perhaps, just perhaps, replenish his battered army enough to mount a desperate defense, if not a counteroffensive. However, the relentless retreat had taken its toll not just on the troops, but on Rommel's standing with the German High Command in Berlin. They were already making quiet arrangements for his replacement, suggesting sick leave, thinly veiled attempts to sideline a general whose star was perceived to be fading. But Rommel, ever the stubborn fighter, refused. He clung to command, perhaps believing he was the only one who could salvage the impossible. Ironically, a brief reprieve came from Montgomery's characteristically cautious and slow pursuit. This allowed Rommel to prioritize fuel deliveries, enabling many of his precious Panzer divisions to limp across the Tunisian border. Yet, this triage came at a devastating cost. The Italian troops, lacking vehicles, were left behind, many falling prisoner to the British. It was a stark illustration of the Axis's deteriorating situation, a desperate choice between preserving the core of their German fighting force at the expense of their allies, and further exposing the vulnerabilities of their dwindling resources. By January 23, 1943, Tripoli had fallen to the British. To the west, the British First Army, along with the U.S. II Corps and French 19 Corps, were approaching Tunisia from the Algerian border. The stage was set. The Italian Navy and the Luftwaffe, in a frantic effort, poured reinforcements into Tunisia, some even arriving on massive Messerschmitt 323 transport planes, giants of the sky laden with men and machines. These joined German General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim's 5th Panzerarmee. By late January, the Axis had amassed around 104,000 German and 74,000 Italian troops. On paper, it sounded formidable, but the reality was grim. Both panzer armies were severely under-equipped. Rommel's force alone had lost 2/3 of its tanks and half-tracks, and almost all of its artillery during the grueling retreat. The only silver lining was a local air superiority provided by approximately 800 Luftwaffe aircraft, a stark contrast to the overwhelming air dominance the Allies would soon exert. Tunisia itself presented a completely different battlefield than the open deserts of Libya. Gone were the vast, flat expanses where tank formations could sweep across the terrain. Here, mountain ridges, narrow passes, and treacherous salt marshes made rapid maneuver and advance exceedingly difficult. This rugged topography, however, offered a paradoxical advantage to the cornered Axis. It allowed them to establish defensive positions that, for a time, prevented the rapid capture of the vital ports by the spread-out Allied forces. The Allies, meanwhile, were consolidating their positions along the East Dorsale Mountains. Eisenhower, eager to press the advantage, requested permission to drive a decisive wedge between von Arnim and Rommel's forces. But his British colleagues, ever the pragmatists, viewed the plan as overly ambitious. They advocated waiting for Montgomery's 8th Army to arrive, a strategy born partly from their inherent caution and partly from a deep-seated skepticism regarding the combat readiness of the American troops. This skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded. Many U.S. officers had never seen combat, and major maneuvers in 1941 had revealed significant deficiencies in senior leadership, tactical acumen, and infantry training. While retraining efforts had corrected some issues, Eisenhower himself noted a worrying complacency among some of his officers. Rommel, ever the shrewd observer, had already dismissed the U.S. troops as Britain's Italians, a cutting remark that highlighted a dangerous underestimation of a nascent, but rapidly learning, fighting force. This initial Allied hesitancy and internal distrust would prove costly. With Montgomery's arrival still weeks away, estimated for early March, the Axis High Command decided to seize the initiative. Their goal, to strike the Allies in the West before the full weight of the 8th Army could be brought to bear. Von Arnim's forces had already achieved some minor successes against U.S. and French troops, bolstering his confidence that he could deliver a serious blow in southern Tunisia. Once Rommel arrived, the Germans adopted a two-part plan. Operation Frühlingswind, or Spring Breeze, was von Arnim's brainchild. It envisioned his 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions striking against vulnerable U.S. positions around Sidi Bou Zid, a crucial supply base and headquarters for the U.S. 1st Armored Combat Command A. The idea was to pin down the Americans there. Once that was achieved, Rommel's Panzerarmee would launch Operation Morgenluft, or Morning Air, a rapid strike from Gabes to Gafsa, and then through the critical Kasserine Pass. The aim was to disrupt the Allied lines and potentially break through to their rear areas. However, German headquarters was far from a picture of unified command. Rommel and von Arnim famously detested each other. Their animosity, a dangerous luxury in wartime, only intensified as they were forced to work together. This meant that overall Commander Albert Kesselring was constantly intervening, trying to smooth over ruffled feathers and bridge deep personal and tactical divisions. It was a command structure riddled with friction, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. Adding to the peril, these dual operations had no definitive endpoint. German commanders were simply expected to quickly draw up extended plans based on their immediate results, a reactive rather than truly strategic approach that left much to chance. Then, on February 14th, a day etched into the memory of every American soldier who fought there, von Arnim unleashed Frühlingswind. 2 armored columns burst out of Faid, supported by the terrifying shriek of Stuka dive bombers and the thunder of artillery. The Panzers caught the green U.S. troops around Sidi Bouzid completely by surprise. Imagine being a young American, fresh from training, suddenly confronted by the raw, brutal efficiency of Rommel's veterans. The speed, the shock, the coordinated fire. It was a baptism of fire. A nightmare made real. Isolated on 2 hilltops, the U.S. infantry found themselves unable to move or provide mutual support. Communications, already unreliable, broke down under the onslaught. In the chaos, Colonel Thomas Drake of the 168th Infantry Regiment penned a desperate report, not on official forms, but on a piece of toilet paper, a stark symbol of the desperation of the moment. He wrote, "Enemy surrounds 2nd Battalion, located on Mont Lesouda, shelled, dive-bombed, and tank attack. Germans have absolute superiority, ground and air. Am attempting to hold my CP position. Unless help from air and armor comes immediately, infantry will lose immeasurably." This wasn't just a military report. It was a cry for help, a visceral snapshot of a unit on the brink. But help was far away. His commander, Lieutenant General Lloyd Fredendall, was over 100 kilometers away in Tebessa, detached from the immediate brutal reality of the front. The following day, February 15th, Shermans and Stuarts of the 1st Armored Combat Command A attempted a counterattack. It was an act of desperate courage, but ultimately a tragic slaughter. The experienced German Panzers, masters of their craft, unleashed airburst artillery that forced U.S. tank commanders to button up inside their turrets, drastically reducing their visibility and speed. Lieutenant Kurt Wolff, a German tank commander, vividly recalled the brutal efficiency of the engagement. Scarcely had the first shells left our guns than the first 3 enemy tanks were on fire. Soon, there were at least 15 burning tanks ahead of us, and the remaining enemy tanks had retreated. The battalion commander, laughing like a boy, went from company to company, asking us and himself, too, "Did you ever see anything like that?" The sheer, almost casual brutality of the German veterans facing inexperienced foes was a shocking reality check. The panicked withdrawal of the U.S. forces quickly devolved into a rout, with troops fleeing their positions, leaving behind a battlefield littered with burning vehicles and shattered morale. Meanwhile, Rommel's troops launched Operation Morgenluft. Their main target, Gafsa, was found abandoned. The Americans, reeling from the initial attacks, had withdrawn. Here, however, a critical moment passed. Instead of ruthlessly pursuing the fleeing Americans, the Axis units advanced cautiously, almost hesitantly. This unexpected slowness gave the U.S. troops a precious window of opportunity to take up new defensive positions on the western dorsales. Rommel, who had been overseeing the final elements of the Libyan evacuation, quickly relocated to take command of the next stage. The success of Frühlingswind and Morgenluft, despite the Gafsa delay, seemed to reinvigorate him. He saw a chance, a glimmer of his old audacity. Fueled by this renewed confidence, Rommel began to develop an even more ambitious plan: to surround Allied forces in western Tunisia. He believed that if he could gain command of all of von Arnim's armor, including the formidable heavy Tiger tanks, he could punch through the Kasserine Pass, capture the critical U.S. supply depot and headquarters at Tebessa. Once resupplied with captured fuel, He envisioned a lightning strike 225 kilometers further to Bone on the Algerian coast, effectively encircling and annihilating the entire Allied force. It was a classic Rommelian gamble, bold and audacious. He eagerly dispatched the plan to Kesselring and the Italian Commando Supremo, convinced he had found the key to turning the tide. But Rommel's ambitions clashed head-on with von Arnim's more conservative mindset. Von Arnim was vehemently against the idea. He wanted to keep his panzers for a more limited operation towards the British depot at Le Queff. While unlikely to achieve a complete Allied defeat in the West, this would severely cripple them for the foreseeable future, creating a stronger defense against Montgomery's anticipated arrival. The result, predictably, was a disastrous compromise. Rommel received von Arnim's panzers, but was ordered to use them to strike towards Le Queff, not his preferred Bone. Rommel's new plan, Operation Sturmflut, Storm Surge, was set for February 19th. Two main columns would strike simultaneously towards the mountain passes at Kasserine and the Spiba Gap. Rommel would then reinforce whichever thrust showed the most promise. The Desert Fox was far from happy. This forced compromise, this dilution of his strategic vision, festered within him. He later poured his frustrations into his memoirs, a bitter indictment of the High Command's indecisiveness. At other times, our higher authorities were so wildly over-optimistic that they hardly knew what to demand of us next. Now, however, when a little boldness really was required, they lacked the guts to give a wholehearted decision. It was a rare public criticism from a general known for his loyalty, revealing the deep cracks forming at the very top of the Axis command structure. This wasn't just a tactical dispute. It was a fundamental clash of philosophies and personalities, one that would have dire consequences. Guarding the Kasserine Pass was a weak U.S. force under Colonel Alexander Stark. His cryptic orders from the distant Fredendall were a telling sign of the general's state of mind, referencing a famous, stubborn, and costly last stand from the U.S. Civil War. Go to Kasserine right away and pull a Stonewall Jackson. The problem was, Stark's men were mostly construction troops, engineers, and support personnel who had never seen combat. They struggled to build a hasty defensive line, managing to plant a mere 3,000 mines, many of which were simply laid on the road rather than properly concealed. They did have some help from a resilient, horse-drawn French battery of 75mm guns, a poignant anachronism on a modern battlefield. Crucially, powerful Allied armor reserves were held far to the rear, a direct consequence of the terror and lessons learned from the Sidi Bou Zid disaster. No one wanted a repeat. At first, Rommel tried to force the pass with a decisive frontal strike through the valley. But the French artillery, firing with desperate accuracy, and the U.S. machine guns, manned by green but determined troops, pushed back the attackers. German commanders, realizing the futility of a direct assault, ordered their panzer grenadiers to scale the heights on either side of the pass, intending to clear out the stubborn U.S. infantry. Both attacks initially gained some ground, but a critical lack of air support and integrated artillery fire meant the Germans soon had to retire, unable to consolidate their gains. Still, though the defense largely held, Axis troops were slowly, inexorably advancing. The pressure on the Americans was immense. Fredendall, now clearly overwhelmed, even began making preparations to abandon his headquarters at Tebessa, displaying a lack of nerve that would prove catastrophic for his career. Meanwhile, the German strike against Spiba was faring poorly. British and U.S. anti-tank guns, well-positioned and effectively commanded, repelled the attack with heavy losses for the Germans. Rommel, recognizing the futility of dividing his strength, made the fateful decision to focus all available resources on Kasserine, including the newly arrived Nebelwerfer rocket artillery, a weapon that would bring a new level of terror to the American defenders with its distinctive, mournful howl and devastating impact. Late on February 20th, the relentless German pressure finally broke the American lines. U.S. troops abandoned their positions, leaving their armor unsupported and exposed. The brave French artillerymen, having fired every last shell, spiked their guns, a grim, honorable ritual of defeat, and fell back. There was nothing left to stop Rommel's Panzers. They breached the pass, encountering and destroying a small British armored force sent in a desperate attempt to block them. For a fleeting moment, victory seemed within Rommel's grasp. Flushed with this hard-won success, Rommel once again succumbed to his characteristic audacity. But this time, it proved to be a fatal misjudgment. He split his force into 3 prongs, launching simultaneous attacks towards Tebessa, Thala, and Spiba. It was a bold move, typical of the Desert Fox, but in this specific context, it weakened his offensive punch precisely when he needed it most. The Axis offensive, already losing steam, was now fragmented. The tide, however, was already turning. Fresh Allied troops, including seasoned veterans and newly reinforced units, along with vital armor and overwhelming artillery, were rushing to the front. The initial American shock was giving way to a more determined, organized resistance. By splitting his forces, Rommel had inadvertently sacrificed the concentrated power that had once made his blitzkriegs so terrifying. Although the Germans briefly reached Thala, Allied material superiority was rapidly asserting itself. By February 23rd, with clear skies bringing with them the menacing buzz of Allied air attacks, it became undeniably clear. Le Queff was unreachable. Rommel, with a heavy heart, called off the attack. The Battle of Kasserine Pass was over. The aftermath of Kasserine Pass revealed it to be a defeat for both the U.S. and German forces, albeit in different ways. For the Americans, it was a brutal, humiliating baptism of fire. U.S. commanders were deeply disappointed by their performance. General Fredendall, in particular, became the scapegoat, accused of hunkering down in his bunker, physically and psychologically detached from the front lines, failing to issue clear and decisive orders. Historian Robert Citino minces no words, concluding, "Although blaming the general is the most simplistic form of military history, it is occasionally hard to avoid. The evidence against Fredendall is overwhelming." Following Kasserine, he was swiftly replaced by the notoriously demanding and effective General George Patton, signaling a fundamental shift in American leadership and strategy. Yet, some historians have been more forgiving of Fredendall, suggesting his failure was indicative of wider systemic issues. The challenge of rapidly transforming a small, peacetime army into a massive warfighting force meant that many officers, from junior lieutenants to senior generals, were untested. Their tactics were often unsuited to modern, mechanized warfare. It was a steep learning curve, paid for in blood. Furthermore, considering their severe lack of experience, the U.S. troops performed remarkably well against German veterans, even according to Rommel himself. He reportedly stated, "Die Amerikaner hatten sich vorzüglich geschlagen," meaning, the Americans performed excellently. It was a grudging compliment, but a testament to the inherent fighting spirit of the American soldier, even in the face of overwhelming odds and initial tactical blunders. Rommel, too, faced criticism for his decisions at Kasserine. His choice to split his forces after breaching the pass, and his expectation of rapid drives in mountainous terrain, puzzled many. Some historians find it surprising, given his extensive experience fighting in the Alps during World War I, that he didn't prioritize clearing the strategic heights before committing his armored thrust. However, Rommel likely felt he didn't have the luxury of time. Montgomery's Eighth Army was closing in, and every hour counted. His strained relationship with von Arnim also had a devastating impact on the operation. Rommel was outraged to discover that von Arnim had only sent half of the promised 10th Panzer Division, and critically, had withheld all of the heavy Tiger tanks for himself. Von Arnim, in a demonstration of his own flawed judgment, subsequently used these precious Tigers in his own ill-fated offensive on February 26th, losing an astonishing 15 of his 19 Tiger tanks. These were losses the Germans simply could not afford. By March, they were receiving only 29,000 tons of the required 140,000 tons of supplies. Meanwhile, the U.S. alone was bringing in over 400,000 tons. The industrial chasm between the Axis and Allied powers was becoming an unbridgeable canyon, and these irreplaceable tank losses underscored the Axis's terminal logistical decline. What remained of the Axis army in Africa would now be needed to face off against Montgomery in the east. Rommel rapidly relocated to the Mareth Line, a series of pre-war French forts, to confront his old opponent. He disliked the position, seeing it as too static, too defensive, not conducive to his style of mobile warfare. But his superiors, desperate, demanded that he stop the Eighth Army outside of Tunisia. Hitler, ever prone to grand, unfulfillable promises, vowed to send new weapons and reinforcements. But by now, these were empty words. Rommel had a mere 160 tanks, mostly Italian, against Montgomery's formidable 800. The Luftwaffe, decimated by losses and fuel shortages, had virtually vanished from the Tunisian skies. Knowing Montgomery was getting stronger by the day, Rommel ordered a desperate spoiling attack to disrupt British preparations for a major offensive on March 6th. However, even this final desperate gambit was plagued by insubordination. His subordinates, disagreeing with his recommendation to attack along the coast, instead launched a frontal assault in the south. Montgomery's dug-in tanks and anti-tank guns, including the powerful 17-pounders, were waiting. A British veteran, incredulous at the suicidal nature of the attack, recalled, "The silly buggers came right at us, didn't they? Some of us who were in the early desert fighting expected a Rommel flank attack, something clever. It never happened. They kept coming straight across the plain." Montgomery himself, typically blunt, put it more succinctly. "The Marshal has made a balls of it." Though only 94 Axis troops were killed, Rommel lost up to 56 tanks in what would be his final action as a commander in North Africa. On March 9th, the Desert Fox, physically and emotionally shattered, finally agreed to take sick leave and returned to Germany. It was the end of an era. With Rommel gone, Montgomery launched his main attack on March 16th. It was a classic Montgomery plan. A frontal charge, supported by a wider flanking maneuver, largely carried out by New Zealand, Indian, and French Senegalese soldiers. The frontal assault initially gained some ground, establishing a precarious bridgehead across the Wadi Zigzag, but Allied troops soon lost the position with heavy casualties. Frustrated but unyielding, Montgomery prioritized the flanking maneuver. Indian Gurkha troops, using their formidable mountain experience, moved stealthily through rough terrain, attacking the Mareth Line from behind. Meanwhile, the New Zealand Corps rushed further to the Axis rear, decisively breaking through Axis defenses on March 26th. Rommel's replacement, General Giovanni Messe, tried to fall back to the narrow Wadi Akarit position, but the Allied juggernaut was relentless. His lines were overrun by a combined assault of overwhelming artillery bombardment, determined frontal charges, and relentless mountain infiltration. The situation for the Axis troops was now dire, bordering on hopeless. Hitler, in a tragic display of delusion, still hoped Tunis and Bizerte could become meat grinders, a brutal, protracted defense designed to deplete Allied forces and delay an inevitable invasion of Europe. But morale and equipment were critically lacking. By April, von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army had a mere 150,000 men and 150 tanks against a combined Allied force of 210,000 troops and 1,200 tanks. The disparity was staggering. Patton, now at the helm of the U.S. II Corps, quickly regained U.S. positions at Gafsa and Sened Station, eventually linking up with the 8th Army on April 7th, symbolizing the successful execution of the pincer movement. Now, the 8th Army clashed against the new Axis positions at Enfidaville. Again, the initial assaults failed, but mountain troops, including the tenacious Gurkhas, backed up by accurate, concentrated artillery fire, finally broke the position open. The sheer volume of Allied firepower was overwhelming. For every Axis artillery shell fired, the British fired up to 30. The U.S. II Corps, under the revitalized command of General Omar Bradley, redeployed to the north, battering their way towards Bizerte with renewed confidence, having learned their hard lessons at Kasserine. Von Arnim, facing the inevitable, sent Major Hans von Luck to Berlin to plead for an evacuation, to save what remained of his forces. But Hitler, in a fatal decision, refused to even see him. When Hitler finally allowed an evacuation in late April, it was a meaningless gesture. The Axis lacked any air cover or shipping capacity to make it happen. The trap had sprung shut. On May 7, 1943, the Allies captured Bizerte and Tunis. The end was swift and decisive. On May 13th, Axis forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, surrendered en masse. Many were Italian non-combat and colonial troops, but many were also German veterans from storied units like the 15th and 21st Panzer and 90th Light Divisions, who surrendered to a man. A contingent of the elite Hermann Göring Division that had fought fiercely in Tunisia was also captured, though a few managed to escape to Sicily. Almost immediately, Allied troops began to refer to the Tunisia campaign as Tunisgrad, a direct and powerful reference to the recent, equally decisive Soviet victory at Stalingrad. This wasn't just due to the tough fighting, but to the seemingly total nature of the victory and the sheer number of prisoners taken. Tunisia was far from an easy victory for the Allies. The disasters at Sidi Bouzid and Kasserine Pass, while momentary, tainted British perceptions of the Americans for some time, highlighting the brutal learning curve of new troops in a complex war. In total, the Allies suffered approximately 70,000 casualties in Tunisia. The U.S. alone lost 2,715 dead, 9,000 wounded, and 6,500 missing or captured in what was their first major theater of operations. Of course, these numbers don't approach the cataclysmic Soviet losses at Stalingrad, but they represented a significant portion of the roughly 240,000 Allied casualties for the entire North African theater since 1941. Axis losses in Tunisia amounted to 62,200 casualties, with 12,200 killed. Similar to Stalingrad, however, the capture of Tunisia trapped and effectively destroyed a massive Axis force of over 250,000 men. Army Group Africa may not have been as central to Axis war plans as the 6th Army at Stalingrad, but its defeat was still a catastrophic investment in manpower and resources. It eliminated tens of thousands of experienced troops and vast quantities of material that Germany desperately needed elsewhere, particularly on the Eastern Front. In a stark demonstration of their strategic myopia, the Germans even redirected transport planes originally earmarked for Stalingrad to Tunisia, inadvertently crippling their supply efforts in both critical locations. The Luftwaffe struggled immensely to recover from the losses it suffered over Tunisia and the Mediterranean theater, amounting to a staggering 41% of their entire air force. This victory was total, absolute. The Axis would never be able to return to Africa, nor would they even contemplate it. From now on, they would be forced into a purely defensive posture, desperately concerned with the defense of their core European territories. Meanwhile, Allied confidence, especially among the British, soared after the early war disasters of 1939 to 41. Despite the initial setbacks at Kasserine, Allied forces were rapidly perfecting an operational doctrine that seamlessly combined high levels of mechanization with sophisticated logistics and thorough battle plans. This newfound proficiency allowed them to effectively translate their overwhelming advantage in industrial capacity onto the battlefield, turning the tide of attrition in their favor. The victory also starkly illuminated the faltering nature of the German way of war. German principles of Auftragstaktik, or mission command, which emphasized autonomy and flexibility at lower levels of command, were coming unstuck against the sheer material superiority and overwhelming firepower of the Allies. Such methods worked brilliantly in the early war against inexperienced and unprepared enemies, allowing lightning advances and exploitation of weakness. But the Allied method, while often described as inflexible, plodding, and all about material superiority by German tactical analysts like Paddy Griffith, left little room for the mistakes the Axis could exploit. The brutal truth was, as Griffith concluded, the Germans could not win such a battle. The rest of the fateful year of 1943, with Kursk and the invasion of Sicily and Italy still to come, would only make this trend even clearer. So, what profound lessons can we glean from Rommel's last battle in North Africa? First, the indispensable nature of adaptive leadership. The contrast between Fredendall's detachment and Patton's decisive command is stark. It highlights that in the crucible of war, effective leadership isn't just about strategy. It's about presence, clear communication, and the ability to inspire confidence, even in defeat. Rommel himself, a brilliant tactician, was ultimately undone by a toxic command structure and a fatal underestimation of his new enemy. His genius could not overcome the deep-seated animosity with von Arnim, nor could it magically conjure the resources he so desperately needed. This reminds us that leadership, even at its most brilliant, operates within a larger ecosystem. If that ecosystem is broken, if trust and coherence are absent, even the most legendary figures can stumble. Second, the brutal reality of a steep learning curve. The American forces at Kasserine suffered immensely, but they learned. They adapted. They transformed from green, complacent troops into a formidable fighting force in a remarkably short period. The casualties were high, but the lessons were invaluable. This underscores the often unseen cost of first contact in warfare and the importance of resilience and rapid adaptation. It tells a story not just of military strategy, but of human endurance and the capacity to overcome initial failures. Third, the evolving nature of modern warfare. Tunisia marked a turning point where sheer industrial might, sophisticated logistics, and combined arms operations began to decisively outweigh individual tactical brilliance. The Axis's reliance on ingenuity and improvisation, while effective in earlier campaigns, couldn't withstand the Allied machine. This wasn't just a battle of tanks and men. It was a battle of factories, supply lines, and operational doctrine. The methodical, often brutal application of overwhelming force, backed by an industrial juggernaut, proved to be the winning formula. It solidified the notion that World War II was not just a conflict of individual heroes or brilliant generals, but a total war of nations, where every aspect of a country's power, from its factories to its logistical planners, played a critical role. And finally, perhaps the most poignant lesson from Rommel's last stand is the unyielding grip of fate when the tide of war has truly turned. Rommel, the master of maneuver, found himself cornered, forced into defensive actions he despised, and ultimately unable to reverse the inevitable. His final efforts were characterized by desperation, flawed compromises, and a recognition that the game was already lost. His departure from North Africa wasn't just a sick leave. It was an acknowledgement that the desert, once his stage for glory, had become his tomb of ambition. The Battle of Tunisia, often overshadowed by the larger, more dramatic campaigns of the Eastern Front or the later D-Day landings, was a crucial, devastating blow to the Axis. It eliminated 250,000 men and vast amounts of material, permanently securing the Allied control of the Mediterranean and setting the stage for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. More than that, it demonstrated the Allied capacity to learn, adapt, and ultimately to overcome even the most legendary of adversaries. It was a crucible that forged new leaders and new fighting forces, laying the groundwork for the ultimate victory that would follow. The sands of Tunisia buried Rommel's North African dreams, but they nurtured the seeds of Allied triumph, a testament to the enduring lessons of war, leadership, and the relentless march of history.